Phil Reed was known as the Prince of Speed, and for good reason, for he had some of the most outstanding achievements on the Grand Prix circuit. Phil had one of the most excellent runs in motorcycle racing, with over 121 podium standings in the Grand Prix, making him one of the most successful motorcycle riders in his era. He was one of Britain's most successful riders, but he also had a very controversial side to his riding. He's best known for handing Yamaha their first World Championship title in 1964, and 4 more titles for Yamaha, with one as a privateer together with 2 Premier Class World Championships in the 500cc category in 1973 and 1974. He had 52 wins in the FIM Grand Prix and 8 from the races at the Isle of Man TT. Dorna even named him a MotoGP legend in 2002. Phil Reed will not only be remembered for the 8 championship wins at the Isle of Man TT, but also for his defiance against manufacturers, teammate bust-ups, and even a boycott of the Isle of Man TT, taking away its World Championship status, but surprisingly returning later. There is no denying that Phil was one of a kind. He was the first person to ever win 3 World Championships for the 125cc, 250cc, and 500cc categories, and won Yamaha its first 250cc World Championship in 1964, and also the first man with a Yamaha to win at the Isle of Man TT. The first person to claim the 1971 250cc World Championship as a privateer, and the final person to claim the 500cc title for MV Augusta in 1974. He was unstoppable and always put on an amazing performance. Were it not for the fact that his career collided with Mike Hailwood's, he would have done so much more, and he even admitted it. He took down Hailwood on so many occasions, but he was not always so lucky. The motorcycle racing world and Britain will always remember one of their greatest riders. His career was fantastic, and what better way to find out than to live through it? Let's take a look at Phil Reed's racing career, from the amazing wins to the crazy challenges he had to face. Phil was born and raised in Bedfordshire, and by 1956 he'd started racing with the 350cc BSA with his mother's encouragement. It didn't take him long for a victory, because 2 years later he was celebrating his first victory at the Isle of Man TT, which at the time was one of the top motorcycle races. After his victory, he bought a Jaguar Mark II car, but not long after that he went for the E-Type. Towards the end of 1963, Phil was contracted to ride for Yamaha, and that next year he handed them their first 250cc world title. As the season progressed, a furious battle between Yamaha, Suzuki and Honda machines ensued, and is forever remembered in the history of bike racing. Yamaha and Suzuki had 2-stroke machines, while Honda had the 4-stroke. The 2-strokes were fast, but not without engine seizures, a contributing factor that the lubrication available at the time was not on par with the capability of the machine. Riders like Phil were more of crash test dummies than racers, and helped in the development of a new technology that may have put their lives to a stop at any moment were they not lucky. It was hard work, but at the same time, if you've got racing in your blood, an interesting thing to go through. The bikes were difficult to handle, forcing him to brake often, so much that even the engineers had to step in during their test runs. It was risky and wild, as Phil had no idea which riding session could be his last, and at the end of every race, he would be surprised that he even made it out unscathed. Phil prayed that he would not lose his life or become a paraplegic, and for the most part tried not to think about it. Yes, it was an era of uncertainty for the riders, but one that brought about the racing machines we have today. The arms race of 1960 had Yamaha racing the 250cc and 125cc bikes at the GP, making Honda come up with a 5-cylinder 125 and 6-cylinder 250cc. Yamaha counteracted by coming up with their own V4s for the 125 and 250cc. The competition was tough, and at the end of 1967, Suzuki and Honda withdrew from the battle. Yamaha was the only manufacturer left contesting for the 125 and 250cc World Championships in 1968, with Phil and Bill Ivey. Yamaha was on top of the game with no real competitors, so they decided to split the championships between Phil and Ivey, and they both took their respective cups in the 125 and 250cc categories. Both racers adhered strictly to orders until the time Phil took the Bruno 125cc title, and with 3 remaining races, he surprised everyone. Bill had been so optimistic that he would win the 250cc race, but Phil thought otherwise. The championship came to an end at Monza in bitter resentment, as both riders finished with the same number of wins and second places, and the final result had to be decided from their race times during the season. Phil was victorious by 2 minutes and 5.3 seconds. Phil became a privateer once again after Ivy died 10 months later in 1969, and by then, Yamaha was no longer in GP racing. He claimed his 4th title in the 250cc category in 1971, and then in 1973, he was riding with County Rocky Augusta on their 4 strokes together with the very successful Agostini. No one thought Phil could do it, but in 1974 he took down Agostini in the 500cc world title, which made Ago move to Yamaha. Phil claimed the title in 1974 again, the final success a 4-stroke would ever have. In the middle of the season of 1976, Phil quit racing at the age of 36. And the next summer, he came back to the Isle of Man after a long time since the 1970s, when he'd boycotted the event together with Agostini and other top GP riders. The GP race had been too dangerous, and they were not going to take a risk. It was just not worth it in their eyes. British fans had hugely disagreed with Phil's decision to boycott the Isle of Man TT race, and didn't show him much support when he made a comeback because of it. Phil was not only battling the Isle of Man TT because of the danger it presented, but also the amount of money he'd been offered, which was below satisfactory. At the time, he was to be paid £50, around £700 today. The riders also had to pay for everything, including the hotel and the ferry. He was not frightened by the Isle of Man TT, but he and Agostini had concluded that a GP race at the TT would be too dangerous, and at that time decided to boycott the races held there. When he came back, things had changed as the Isle of Man TT no longer had its GP status, and the event promoters were afraid for its future, forcing them to attract big names to keep it going. Phil commented that the promoters had been ripping them off for many years. He was given $6,000 to race there in 1977. He entered 2 races with 2 bikes, and in the end, he earned $20,000, which today would be worth $135,000. So I'm sure he didn't care so much that he'd been booed by hundreds of fans while he was receiving his prize. Nevertheless, his most unforgettable race was the Formula 1 TT 1978 race, where he competed against Mike Hailwood, the 9-time world champion, who was making a return to motorcycle racing after racing cars for over 10 years and retiring from motorsport. Phil was on a factory Honda, while Hailwood was on a Ducati 900 SS with an engine from the Bologna factory. As much as they both began the race apart, they were together in most of the laps as they were cheered on by the heavily supporting fans. It was one of Phil's most exciting times at the Isle of Man TT. As they raced, Phil could tell that Mike's bike was getting closer to him, just by the sound of it, and he made the race more interesting by staying ahead of him as much as he could. In the end though, they were constantly overtaking each other as they waved at each other with a V sign. Although they fought with each other to keep ahead, Phil's Honda couldn't take it anymore and gave in as Mike Hailwood rode to victory. Phil realized after the race that it was just how the cookie crumbled on the day, and later on when he returned to the hotel at Douglas Bay, where they were both staying, he went to Mike's room and congratulated him on his achievement. They went down to the bar and shared several champagne bottles with their friends. The Queen awarded Phil an MBE in 1979 for the services he'd given to motorsport. He showed up at Buckingham Palace with tails and a top hat to receive his award, which he was very proud of. At the end of 1982, Phil retired to focus on his business ventures. He also raced in a few classic racing events. He made a lot of money with his racing, but also lost just as much. He sold boats, distributed Premier helmets, and even started a Surrey Honda dealership. Phil Reed will remain to be one of the most successful racers from Britain, and on motorcycles, he was always a force of nature. A true legend was lost to motorcycling, a man who lived his life on nothing else but his own terms.